Good morning, all. My name is James Dakin. I'm a real estate finance partner at Newmanor Law and also a co-founder. We're focused on real estate work. We don't do anything else, and residential development is a very important sector for us. So over the next hour, we want to explore the challenges the market is facing. And the first thing we have to acknowledge is that these are extraordinary challenges, that we've had essentially 3 shocks in a short space of time, with the effect that Brexit had on labour and materials, the disruption of the pandemic, and now it looks as though we're going to have an energy shock as well with the Ukrainian crisis. And that is a lot of economic disruption in a short space of time for any market, not least resi development. So my job this morning is to guide the conversation, which our 3 special guest stars will be having, to explore the various aspects of the difficulties that the market is facing. So introducing each in turn, first we have Richard Payne. Richard is a chartered quantity surveyor, and during his career he's moved seamlessly from construction consultancy to lending and back again. For the last 2 years, he's been a director of project monitoring at Adair in Mayfair, and so he's been seeing firsthand the difficulties that developers are facing on site. Our second guest is Niall Brown. He co-founded Auxilium Real Estate in 2019 to support clients in the raising of debt for property and investment. But prior to this, he was a lender, notably at Lloyds Bank. And as such, he's well versed in banking structures and processes alongside the current lending appetite of various lenders. So he will be able to help us to understand how the lending market is responding to current pressures. And lastly, but not leastly, we have Andrew Weeks, and he is an associate director at Savills, and he's got a particular focus on the residential market. He provides valuations and consultancy advice to lenders, developers, and landowners. And so he's well placed to help us to understand what market participants are thinking at the moment. And we also have a 5th member of the team, who is Karen, my co-founder at Newmanor Law, and she has the Zoom equivalent of the roving mic. We're very, very keen to have audience participation, so please do ask questions as we go along via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Karen will be keeping an eye out for you and your contributions, and she'll put them to the panel for you. Now, because we've been robbed of an hour by British summertime, we thought we would just start with a little bit of audience participation, at least to get your mouse fingers going. We've got a short poll that we want to put to you, and it's really about the balance of working in the office versus working from home, because we think that that will inform the kind of product that the market will be providing in the future. We've got the responses in, and it's a judicious mix, a very well balanced mix of not going in at all, being at home full time, and a sort of sensible, moderate number of days in the middle. So that's very interesting. That presents some challenges for the developers, I'm sure, to encompass that breadth of different view. So let's get to the meat of the presentation, and I want to start with you, Andrew, if I may. And talk about essentially about buyer demand. You know, what are the units that are selling at the moment? How do you see the occupier market generally? And let's just take it from there.
Yeah, thank you, James. Well, it's certainly been an extraordinary kind of period over the last 18 months. We've seen, as everyone here probably knows, very strong price growth since summer of 2020, really, across all regions. And across all price brackets as well. Everything from the first-time buyer markets through the mid markets and up into the prime country and urban markets too. Everything seems to have experienced the same buoyancy and positivity in terms of price growth and buyer demand generally. I think the current thing that seems to be driving price growth now is a lack of stock coming to the market. Savills did a survey recently which suggested that something like 90% of people responded that the lack of stock was something that had inhibited them moving or had played a part in inhibiting them purchasing a property. So clearly, where there's a market where new stock coming is very constrained, those properties that do come to market will, be the target of a lot of people, and that is where we are seeing this kind of price growth continuing even now. So I think even with interest rates rising and the general economic context that we're seeing, currently occupier markets tend to be still very strong, I think.
Okay, that's good to hear. And have you noticed a change in the kind of units that buyers are looking for over that period?
I think yes, to some extent. I think the key priorities of buyers are still there. Good locations, proximity to outside space and parks, transport networks close to their families, good schools, all of those kind of fundamental reasons why people buy a home are still there. I think we have seen a trend of people who have wanted to work from home, requiring more space, or at least flexible spaces within their houses to allow them to work from home. But I think it's important to remember that flexibility is quite important here. It's not just about people who work in offices being able to work from their homes. These are spaces which need to also function as places for children to play, people to exercise, and generally to entertain guests and things like that. So I don't think it's a case of we need to rip up the design rule book and start again. But I think there needs to be a recognition that there is, this new part of people's lives, or at least some people's lives, that they are looking for when they're buying a home. But equally, we've got to remember that not everyone does work from home. Only about 50% of us work in offices. So those of us who work in hospitals and the leisure industry and all these other things, working from home has never been an option, or was only an option for a short period of time. So I think we've got to remember that from that sector of buyers, the traditional demands and traditional priorities are still very much the drivers of demand.
I have one question for you, Andrew. In terms of space, sort of accommodation with no outside space, is that still saleable?
It's certainly still saleable. I think it's gone up buyers' priorities lists. I think it's fair to say. So we, as I say, we did a survey in February of buyers' priorities, which suggested that proximity to open space was the #1 priority. And the HBF recently did a survey which suggested that having private outdoor space was the #1 priority. So slightly different results there. But I think we've got to remember as well that, that in particularly in high density urban areas, flatted schemes, that isn't always an option. And there's no reason to say that those types of properties are no longer saleable. It just might be that, perhaps people are trading in some of that commuting time or distance from central areas for a bit more space. But equally, perhaps younger people, perhaps a bit sick of working from home and, living in more rural areas, and actually want to be back in the city and back in the buzz and the hype. And, I think we've got to remember that, there's always a new generation of buyers coming up behind us who want different things. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And, to answer your question, yes, they're still saleable.
Good.
Do you see the economic headwinds generally having any effect on what people want to buy? I suppose I'm thinking particularly of spiking energy prices? Does that affect people's decisions, or are they still in last year's mode?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Especially with what we're seeing currently with the cost of energy bills, doubling or trebling, people are saying in some cases. There's no question that the energy efficiency of people's homes is rising up the kind of agenda. Again, I think something like 32% of people, so about a third of people, say that the EPC rating of their next property is a high priority, and that's that has increased from previous surveys. And again, the HBF published data recently, and whilst they obviously an industry group for new build housing, suggests that there's something like £550 a year savings on energy bills in a new build versus a second-hand property. So perhaps we see ever more increasing focus on energy efficiency, and does that perhaps result in a push from the second-hand markets into the new build markets, because those new builds do offer that energy efficiency, and in a context of price rises and energy bills rising and all of the rest of it, actually that perhaps starts to look a bit more attractive. So I think it does play a part. I also wonder if the cost of energy leads people to reconsider the amount of time they spend working from home. If that's their working pattern, and they're having to heat their home during the day, use their lights, use their kettles, all the rest of it, it may not add up to a huge amount of money in reality compared perhaps with the cost of commuting, say. But I think the perception of that is, well, hang on, I've got, if I go to the office, I've got free electricity, I can charge my phone, I can make a cup of coffee, and the heating's on and I can turn it all off at home and come back later. So these are all sorts of interesting things that come into it. But I think as a general point, the energy efficiency of properties is certainly something that we're all got to be more and more aware of.
It does sound as though there's quite a way to go before it becomes something that most people are thinking about, though, if it's only a third of people who are currently worried about the EPC. So there's potentially a big change that might happen there if energy prices spike in the way we think they're going to.
Yeah, I mean, if I can,
yes.
Point, the Andrew's point there, that only 15% of us work in offices.
So, sorry, Richard, 50.
Oh, 50. Sorry, that was that does make a big difference.
Okay, very good. So that's been really helpful, Andrew. I thought at this point I would massively oversimplify the changes that the markets are having on home design to reflect modern priorities, and ask the very simple question, from the perspective of the participants, what is more important? False dichotomy, of course, home, office, or garage, because I guess your garage could be converted to just about anything, only a home office. But that is the question that I'm asking at the moment. So looking forward to the answers. There's a clear but not overwhelming victory for the working from home space, which I think is not a surprise considering the experiences that the people that on this call, our jobs are flexible enough, and it's certainly a really big help. So thank you for that. Let's now turn to you, if I may, Richard, and talk about what's happening on site, what's happening to construction costs, and how developers are coping.
Morning, everyone. Costs are, of course, going up. I don't think that's a surprise to everyone. No one is going to be that shocked by that. And that in its main can trace itself back to obviously the Brexit stroke pandemic point of view. The biggest single problem here is the supply of materials. During the pandemic, many of the suppliers chose to sell all their stock. Many suppliers pre-pandemic would keep stock because they knew they would sell it on a rolling program. During lockdown, there was massive uncertainty on the sale of building materials, and so suppliers wound down their stock. So now when you want to buy some materials, you might not necessarily be able to go to the shelf and buy it off the shelf. You have to wait for it, and it has to be built, made for you. And so that has increased the costs of the building materials. In addition, there was post-Brexit an immediate labour shortage. I think that has now gone. I think I am seeing developers and builders complaining a lot about the ability to buy materials, but I don't hear any noise about the shortage of people to work on sites. Whether that's returning people that went back home during the pandemic and have, or immediately post-Brexit and have now returned to the UK, or the availability of UK-based labour force. I'm not 100% sure. I think it's because there are the returning labour force that went home for the pandemic that have now come back. It matters not. It doesn't seem to be a thing. What is a thing is the ability to buy, for example, and metaphorically, I'm going to use Windows as my example, but to buy Windows on time to fit in the program and how you buy them. Previously, 3 years ago, the cash flow situation was different. These days, for buying many materials, and I'm thinking certainly of steel, of roof timbers, of windows, and any kitchen units, for example, before any manufacturer is going to start making these for you, they require a 50% down payment. That, because it was stock and because of the trust in the system, wasn't as much the case, but it now is, and this is causing developers cash flow problems. And Niall will touch on this later, in that, I'm sure, in that barely a building project goes by without a developer asking for 50% of the cost of building materials before there is anything arrived on site or before anything is even manufactured. Now that, of course, gives a lender a major problem because he's paying out, let's say, £50,000 for the roof timbers or whatever it is, and there's nothing to take a charge over. He can only take a charge when it gets to the site, as long as it's secure. And so the developer, or either the lender, is going to have to take that risk on, that he's paying out £50,000 and it isn't secured, or the developer is going to have to cash flow the £50,000 until the materials arrive on site, which, let's say, will be 2 or 3 months. And that generally is a problem for most small-time developers. So that is a problem that needs to be solved. Generally is being solved at the moment by several of the lenders taking that risk. And it is often a question that will be asked by a developer as to will he be able to get down payments from a particular lender. And it might be the decision maker for the developer that he can get upfront payment. It's just to be borne in mind. Other drivers of inflation now are, of course, the post-pandemic era, which is still a problem. And yes, now with the prevalence of more and more people getting COVID, albeit in a less threatening type, it still means that the crane operator or the digger operator or whatever it is, or the brickies, have got 10 days off work because they've got a mild form of COVID. They still can't come to work. And that is also proving a problem. I accept that proves a problem the country over and in every facet of business. And as yet, the problems with energy are not fully worked through the system. And I couple the energy crisis with the war in Ukraine crisis. And that's without wishing to insult the war in Ukraine, but the problems that manifest themselves on sites are all the energy cost. And it's not just the cost of energy, pure and simple. It's also connection times for the utilities. That is a major problem. They all want their money up front, and they won't even book you in to get your utility connected until you've paid the down payment. And then there is at least a 3-month waiting period. And it is not without significant precedent that the sites are being delayed for their practical completion because one or other of the utilities has not been connected. The buildings are finished, but they're not connected, so therefore they're not practically complete. No one can live in them until those. So those are major problems. The increased cost in energy hasn't fully worked its way through the system. After all, the increased cost of energy doesn't occur 3 days.
Absolutely.
Richard, something you're just picking up on something you were mentioning there. How much is a developer able to push things like the down payments onto the contractor as opposed to having to pay it directly themselves? If they've got an agreement in place where it's for the contractor to deliver, presumably there are opportunities. I can't say all the time where they can ask the contractor to be fronting those costs. I'm guessing this comes down to a size and scale of that contractor.
Well, yes, of course it does, and it depends on the contract and how that's written. But I would imagine that most contractors these days, of course, if they are making a down payment for windows in January, and the windows aren't due to arrive on site until May, let's say, if he's made a down payment and can produce an invoice at the monthly valuation, he's going to slap that straight on the developer's desk and say, I've had to make this payment. You need to pay for me. And by the rules of the JCT, if assuming that that's the contract, it would be very hard to turn that down. If he's had to pay the money, that will be part of it. Now, the next problem occurs if the terms of the JCT do not replicate the terms of the loan. So if the developer has to pay the contractor, but the bank says to the developer, I'm not going to pay for any material till they're on site, that is a cash flow lag of 3 months that the developer, because he has to pay the builder, will have to pay. It would be very difficult, and I'm choosing £50,000 for windows to continue my metaphoric journey. It would be very difficult if the developer said, I'm not paying you for the windows until they're on site. The contractor might say, in that case, I'm not ordering the windows. And that is a stalemate, and you've got a major problem. Ultimately, the developer is going to have to pay for these. And he's going to have to pay for them when the supplier requires the money. There may be a lag of 1 month, but in the grand scheme of things, ultimately, the developer is going to have to make sure that his lender is on side with this. And it's when I'm doing my due diligence, it is one of the first questions I ask the developer and the contractor when I'm on site way before lending is, are you anticipating any prepayment for materials? Do you have materials off site, et cetera, et cetera? Now, this has been commonplace in things like student accommodation where you're building toilet pods and bathroom pods, but at least you can get, in that instance, a vesting certificate, and which gives the lender a charge over the materials, even though they're not on site. But we're talking about something which happens 3 months before that, i.e. before I even start designing these pods, I want £50,000, and that, and pods or windows. And that's the problem. So this is all shoved the cash flow back 3 months from where it was pre-pandemic.
And Richard, is that very prevalent? Are you seeing a lot of that kind of standoff?
Yes. No, not the standoff. No, because the developer knows he has to pay it, and it's then what is key is getting agreement between lender and borrower before this argument starts, if you see what I mean. So if you like, when I'm there, when I'm involved, I am promoting this discussion to take place before the lender has even decided to lend, because you have to get that sorted out. Otherwise, you've got a major problem of cash flow, and that doesn't help anyone, least of all the lender. But if, and you'll often get, of course, the very nature of lenders is that you will get the relationship guy saying, yes, I'll get that sorted out. And then credit might have a slightly different view when it gets to that stage. But the majority of lenders that I'm dealing with, and they're dealing with small-time house builders with somewhere between 5 and 30 units being built, the majority of them accept that this is the way the construction industry currently works, and we're going to have to buy into this if we're in. It still leaves them with a problem of what they get a charge over at this stage, the answer being nothing. So they will do some investigation into the P&L of the supplier, which no one would ever have done 3 years ago, but now is very important.
So, Richard, I mean, I think what that also shows is that it's important from a lender's point of view that due diligence on material supply is done really early.
Oh yes, without a doubt. I.e., this is before tying up the before signing the loan docs. The nature of the beast is that I'm going to have at any one time £45,000, let's say, of rolling down payments, which won't disappear until 3/4 of the way through the construction period. And that's when all those pre-ordered materials have all found themselves on site. Now, one lender I know is currently using the contingency amount within the loan for those down payments. So the effectively, the contingency amount is reduced on a monthly basis by £45,000, but will get re-topped up later. That ultimately that doesn't help, though it gives them comfort. So that is the way that they are psychologically overcoming this problem. And there were, just to add one further point, which is different with it, I was asked, is this increased costs impinging on the profit margin of the developer? Well, yes, from the development appraisal, without a doubt, of course it must do. The happy other side is that, and Andrew will tell you this, this is far more, it appears that every unit that I have been involved in over the last year has sold for more than the amount in the development appraisal, i.e. Units are still increasing in value. But what I have noticed is the increased prevalence of developers building to then rent. So blocks of apartments in old warehouses that would have been sold off plan 5 years ago are now all going to be kept and let within towns and cities, and the developer has formed a separate investment company to hold a great load of rented property. Now that is a sign of the times, which has got nothing to do with any of the three forces of nature that have come up, be that Brexit, COVID, or the current war. This is all due to the fact that mortgages for 30-year-olds are fantastically expensive and can't be put together without the bank of mum and dad lending them the deposit, which is going to be £50,000. So the increased prevalence of rented property, and I'm not talking about it, this isn't necessarily in London, this is all over the country.
I think that's a very interesting point, and it does link back to the conversation that we were having with Andrew, which is that that some units are harder to shift, and I think that just puts another perspective on it. It's not just the units themselves, but it's who they're aimed at and the finances being stretched in that group of individuals.
It's interestingly as well. It's not just the high density apartment markets where you're seeing a rental model produce similar revenues to sales. The kind of suburban build to rent is a feature of the market now as well, where traditional 2-story family housing is being held for rent, and there's a deep pool of demand for that kind of rented accommodation as well as apartments. So yeah, echo what Richard's saying.
And just to come in here, we've got one question which was raised as a result of our last poll. And I think it's an interesting one, really, because the questioner says, does the panel think the votes for a parking space as opposed to home working will change as electric cars become more popular and necessary? I mean, will electric cars dominate the market and the requirement for charging points?
I think. Sorry, I'll go ahead.
All right. I don't have an electric car, but I have some family members that do. And those family members are variously in either very urban areas or slightly more rural. The answer is fairly easy. When you've got a large house with a large parking spaces, etc., you're going to get something put on the side of your building. I think the question is more related to where you don't have that flexibility of space. And I'm going to kind of cop out here in terms of not give an answer, because I don't think we've worked out yet how this is going to work. We've seen, no one knows how a service station is going to work when we're all electric, because you can't go up, charge up for 3 or 4 minutes and then head off yet. But I've seen solutions where they're doing things like taking street lighting and attaching a charger onto that street lighter, so that you can take a conventional road and basically have, wherever there is a street light, that's where your chargers are. So it doesn't necessarily need to be forced into everyone then needs their own sort of parking space, but that still doesn't get around the fact that if you park on your road and there's no spaces next to, say, a charging spot, what do you do? You can't drive around forever trying to find a space for that.
I've got another slight addition to that, and another reason, and I'm going to include off-road parking in this discussion. Just doesn't need to be with a garage. Off-road parking. My daughter is just moving house. She's 25. She lives in Leeds. She, in her current flat or apartment house, whatever, she has on-street parking. And she's just moving to somewhere where she has a drive and has off-road parking, and her insurance has dropped by £500 a year. Now, that pays for all the additional electricity that she's ever going to need in a price hike coming up. And if it's that much money, it will be considered. If you've got 3 cars, and you've all got them all off the road as opposed to being on the street. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be 500 to everyone. She happens to be 25, and so therefore it's quite expensive. But it must be taken into consideration. The other thing which I haven't had an answer from is, of course, we are all going to have electric cars because that's the legislation that's already been brought in by 20, whenever it is. So you're only going to be able to buy electric cars from that point. So there has to be a better system, but going by mobile phones, if you look at the size of a battery for a mobile phone 25 years ago, they were about half the size of a house brick, and the batteries today are much smaller, and they charge more quickly and they last longer. That, I assume, will happen in the motor industry. I'm no expert, but I assume But where are we going to get all the electricity from to charge 20 million cars overnight? They've got to be charged, and we currently have problems with the supply of our electricity. And during the night used to be, or currently is, the cheapest time to use electricity. When everyone's charging their cars, 20 million of them overnight, presumably that won't still be the case, because the electricity companies will be wise to that, and we'll have to charge our cars. And do we have the electricity supply, let alone the distribution, to charge all those cars? Well, I'm sure we don't at the moment, but we will have to get it.
There's a lot of investment necessary.
Oh, absolutely. If you go to, I went to, I don't know whether anybody knows Rugby Services on the M6. It's the first it's a brand new service station on the M6 at about junction 1. If you drive in there, at one side, there are literally 20 to 25 charging points that have been built at the back of the car park. As opposed to, if you go to any current service station, there may be 2 or 3 and then a couple of Tesla charging points. But of course, the norm is now going to be, whenever you build anything, you've got to put a charging point in it. I'm sure will become law that you must put a car charging point in a new home shortly. Whenever they're built, they have to be. They're put in at the moment because they're desirable for sales, etc. But I can see the point where it's going to become law to put in a car charging.
Unless, of course, Richard, the car's battery gets so large and the charging equipment becomes so efficient that you can treat it more like a petrol car again. In which case, we might find we go back to the other way. I'm speculating there, but that's why I think it's.
Sadly, I'm no expert in these things, but I would like to think that's the case. Yes, and I'm sure there are companies. We by definition are not involved in any of this, all of us, but I'm sure there are people working on this, and there will be prizes for those organisations that improve car efficiency to get 500 miles out of a battery.
Yeah, just changing the subject a bit, Richard. Andrew Thornhill in the audience has said, whilst I agree a more pragmatic approach needs to be taken to advance payments, I disagree with Mr. Payne's comments that it would be contractually difficult to not fund down payments if claimed. Listed items must be included in the JCT form of contract for advance payments to become due under the contract. If there are no listed items, the contractor has had the opportunity to include the cost of financing this for say 50k for 3 months.
No, I agree with him that currently the contracts probably don't insist that has to be paid. However, if you like, behavior will take over, and a contractor will say, unless you pay me that, I'm not going to pay the down payment. So you're going to have a problem because he can't afford that. I accept that right now the contracts don't include that, but I'm sure that that it will evolve, that a contractor will insist that that's put into the contracts in time as more and more down payments survive. Sadly, if you're a developer and you just blankly refuse to pay what is a down payment for windows, etc., that a contractor asks for, then probably the contractor ain't going to go through that process a second time, even though in that particular contract it is legally unenforceable, and I don't doubt that for a second. But in the order of a relationship between contractor and developer, it's just refusing to pay some money that a contractor has had to pay in order to get the project going, ultimately won't help the relationship between the two, and probably will be preventative in the contractor doing some more work for that same developer later if he sticks by that mantra. And I think contractors are going to become wise to this and say, if I have to pay any down payments, you will need to pay me, because contractors can't necessarily, we're not talking about Robert McAlpine here or any of the big boys. We're talking about the small provincial contractors, and cash flowing 50 grand is as difficult for them as it is for anyone else.
Okay.
I'd like to take the word cash flow as a sort of segue to Niall to talk about finance, because it's clear that in cash flow terms, even if the rising prices are helping at the back end, that there are cash flow pressures, and we've certainly seen in our work a lot of top-up facilities being provided in various forms. So Niall, how are developers navigating these cash flow pressures?
Well, I mean, starting from a very basic level, the lending market has just been going from strength to strength in terms of the availability of liquidity, the types of funding that is available. There is a lot of new entrants. I'd say on a net basis, the pandemic hasn't really affected. If anything, there is a net higher amount of lenders coming out of the pandemic than there was going in. My thinking here is that, and certainly from the ones that have entered the market, is that debt is becoming seen as such a standard alternative asset class for private equity funds who are surprisingly prolific in the lending market of late. And also the fact that perhaps we've heard from some people that getting equity style returns is becoming harder. So why not get a slightly less but still quite comfortable debt return on your money? And so we're certainly seeing just the availability of liquidity is just unabating. It really seems to be continuing on. To answer your question more directly, then, how are they navigating the sort of pressures on the cash flow? What I guess it seems to be feeding through slowly. So everything that Richard has just talked about, actually, certainly from my perspective, is sort of slightly delayed in terms of how it appears. So the majority of transactions that I've got ongoing right now are, on the face of it, protected by fixed price contracts, say, and to date they've been able to manage those pressures by pointing to whatever's in those contracts and being able to rely on the contractor to be able to manage those. I will also caveat most of the transactions that I've been looking at are sort of in the mid-market space, so sort of perhaps 30 plus units. So where the contractor has balance sheet perhaps to be able to manage some of these costs, but not necessarily. The big battle that we see the most is between the borrower and the lender around contingency. So a borrower is always going to be pointing to say, look, we have a fixed price contract, and therefore realistically what costs can come up. And the normal argument is essentially we don't know, hence why we need that contingency in place. Now, I remember 5 years ago it was very normal, and still is in many cases, but 20% was the standard contingency. Whereas I think what we've seen a lot, particularly on the slightly more nimble debt funds who are providing finances, 5 to 10% appears to be more than enough these days to satisfy the lender. Now, where we then start to get some of the scenarios that Richard is talking about, where rightly or wrongly, and I appreciate some of the technical points that were just being discussed about whether you can increase these costs, that contingency is going to be utilized more and more to manage those costs. And it might be that it needs to be utilized whilst something is being agreed between the lender, the contractor, and the developer in terms of how to manage some of these asks. And it really would just come down to the lender having giving their discretion as to whether that contingency can be used, because another point that we do see related to this is that the lender is increasingly exercising more control in their contracts over how that contingency is used. It's no longer well, it's your contingency, you can use it how you like it. there's either restrictions placed on it to stop it being eaten up far too quickly, or out and out control to say that you need our approval to be able to use them.
It's a very interesting phenomenon. I think that in a time when we're experiencing a lot more volatility, we're actually seeing smaller contingencies, and instinctively the contingency ought to be growing a bit to reflect the level of uncertainty in the market at the moment. And is it more about the competitive pressures among lenders rather than a more I suppose objective assessment of what an appropriate contingency is in a time like this?
No, I'd say that's a large part of it. The competitive space in this industry is, I mean, it's great for the borrower. It's great for people like myself in terms of being able to drive, the most competitive pricing terms, etc., in the market. Whether it's right or wrong is difficult to say. One thing I've noticed is I've not seen a non-fixed price contract in years. Whenever someone comes along, they've always got this agreement in place. They want to be able to say, this is the reason why we don't need, the contingency. Now, the extent to which the contingency dictates exactly, the fixed price contracts dictates going to be the total cost of the project, I think is always underestimated, and that's where lenders need to be. Speaking as an ex-lender, they probably need to be a bit more confident in being able to say there will be costs that aren't being taken into account, which generally comes from professionals, which are outside of those contracts. But we see a lot of reliance, a lot of pressure put back onto people like Richard, where it's to say, well, you testify to say whether you think these costs are appropriate. You testify to say whether there is anything that they're missing from their budget. And the lender does take a very sort of passive approach in terms of putting that onto their advisors, as opposed to making that decision themselves.
Can I just add, James, we're slightly talking at cross purposes. Okay. And this may be a anally construction aimed discussion, in that when I'm talking about price inflation and increased costs, I'm not talking within a contract. I'm talking within the market. So increased costs, the cost of doing this project, starting it in January 2020, as opposed to starting it in January 2021. So when you're fixing a cost. So the increased costs from that the BCIS talk about, and that I as a quantity surveyor talk about, are not those increased costs within a single contract. It's from month to month of the starts of contracts. So there is big cost inflation month on month, but that's not within a single. So if you've got a fixed price contract, I agree, that is a fixed price contract. That's not going to suffer from what we are talking about, which is cost inflation, because it's fixed, and that is fine. I'm not seeing costs going up during a contract any more than they ever used to. So things in the ground, if you hit a great big concrete plug in the ground that you didn't know was there and didn't come up on the surveys, then the client will pay for removing that, because that's what the contract says. If the cost of windows goes up from 40 grand to 60 grand, but the contractor is allowed 40 grand, well, they will be 40 grand, and that's the contractor's bad luck, because he's pitched and that's a fixed price contract. But next time he will put in 80 grand for those windows. And by next time, I said, when his next contract, which may not be involving you, but that's where the cost inflation comes in. Where things become a little more difficult is when you have it in the ever increasing world of the developer builder. When, yes, you have a fixed price contract between a developer and a builder, but the owner of the development company is Joe Bloggs and the owner of the construction organization is Joe Bloggs. And that happens not in the 30 to 50 unit schemes that Niall's talking about, but this happens in the 3 to 15 units type schemes. And the majority of those, and then you have the problem where the developer suffers from increased costs of windows and agrees with his contractor that he will pay the difference. Well, of course he agrees with the contractor who pays the difference because he's the same bloke. So that is where the waters get a bit muddied. But I'm not really talking here about the increased costs of a building contract during the process of the project, because they are fixed, as Niall says, by a fixed price contract.
And I'll come back to my other point about there'll always be a lag, I think, between what you see, Richard, and then what we then see as they start to feed through into those contracts and into the placement there. But there are, of course, a lot of other costs around that contract, notably the professionals and notably the unknown elements that then come out. That I think, James, you're right to point out that we're perverse that we're seeing a squeezing of the contingency at the same time as we are seeing an increase in costs. There is also a sort of very financial element to the contingency, in that most of them are fungible. Some lenders take the approach that this amount has to be used for this, and this amount of the contingency has to be used for this. But most of them are fungible. It can be put towards any cost. And obviously, if you have increasing interest costs, as we are seeing with the market right now, Bank of England, and thus whatever reference rate you are using is being pushed up. That can be allocated towards a contingency, but then that means you've got less contingency for construction costs, and that will come down to your relationship with the lender as to whether you can use them, whether it is fungible, or whether it has to be specifically used for construction related items. I think there's arguments for and against, because generally you make the you size the contingency based on your contract or your total fund construction costs, not taking into account your finance costs. So if we see rates increase dramatically, that could either mean lenders put their foot down and say, no, I want to preserve this for construction costs, or you'll find that borrowers need to start putting more money into it just to make sure that they can maintain their contingency if they want to make sure that they have that there.
The other point is that, of course, if you've got a contingency which is 10% rather than 5%, because the bank insists, and that is very sensible, one, it guards you against having to go back to the bank in a year's time and get an increased facility. It guards you against that. But also the cost of having a 10% contingency over a 5% contingency is just the increase in the arrangement fee. Unless I've missed something, the actual cost of having an extra £100,000 of contingency is just a reflection of the arrangement fee.
You'd be sizing the capital stack a bit differently, so you would have to put more equity in, and for a lot of developers, that's not necessarily optimal, easy.
No, I grant that.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in here because we've got a couple of questions that we haven't dealt with, and one of them I think provides a bit of a switch of focus, which is the question is a lot of focus on the owner-occupier demand. What about the rental market, and how much of an impact will the up-and-coming EPC changes have on the market? So I think probably one for you, Andrew.
Thanks, Karen. Yes, not an easy question, that one. EPC changes looks like they're going to be increased to a minimum of a C rating in 2025. I believe that's the next milestone. Currently up from an E at present. Yeah, no two ways about it, I suppose. That for a lot of landlords, there's a capital expenditure going to be required in that period. In terms of demand, I don't think perhaps EPC ratings are as much of a priority for tenants. Perhaps for some, but when you're tying yourself in perhaps for 12 months, it's not as much of a concern as if you're buying a property. So whilst I think the green agenda will affect all property markets and sectors, the residential rental, private rental sector is probably one of the less affected ones, because the nature of tenancies tends to be quite short term.
Yeah, and I tend to agree there that I think if you're buying, looking at the EPC rating, which usually holds good for 10 years anyway, is much more crucial than if you're doing a 6 month tenancy. So I think it is less of a factor. It's more about where the rating is when you take your tenancy.
And of course, where we've seen some of the most efficient housing is in the affordable housing sector. So, the housing associations are in some ways leading the way on delivering energy efficient housing, albeit supported by grant, etc. So yeah, interesting. But I think in terms of rental demand, that I don't see any signs of that abating, particularly in the context of rising house prices.
We are up against the clock, and we have a minute remaining. Was there another question, Karen, that you got from the audience?
Yes, there's one more question, and I think we've also got one quick poll at the end, haven't we, as well? So the last question is from John Rushton, who says, as chair of Build Studios, the shared workspace for the built environment sector, we are finding that our tenants reflect an occupancy of 100% in the midweek, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So residential spaces will benefit from being able to be modified to provide variable spaces for weekend leisure entertainment working. So movable walls and better space management would be a benefit for a new build selling ? Is this a real benefit for providing a better quality of life?
I'm not an expert on movable walls, but certainly in terms of designing spaces that can be used for a variety of purposes, I completely agree with that. It's not just about working on the laptop. You also need that space to function perhaps as a bedroom, or perhaps as a play area, or whatever else. So I think, yeah, flexibility is key.
The other thing that might be affected by that, Karen, or might give rise to increased amounts of co-living space. We're seeing quite a lot of co-living deals coming to us. We worked on a fair few, and co-living is effectively just student accommodation for adults, but it provides cheap space in a town, well, not in a town, but wherever the co-living is built. But if you are a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday person in an office, a co-living cheap space may be an ideal solution for you. We've seen them built in the centre of London, down in Clapham, for example, or up in Harrow. By central London, I mean the centre of the residential areas of London, but also in places near airports, aimed at airport workers. So that airport workers might choose, let's say in Luton, might choose to, or might live in Yorkshire, come down, work at Luton, stay in the co-living on the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday nights, and then go home again. It provides a cheaper alternative and something slightly more solid than Airbnb.
Okay. Right, as we're a little bit over, and what I would like to do, therefore, is to first of all to thank our panelists for their contributions, which have been really interesting. Thank you all very much. And secondly, just to ask the stalwarts who are still listening to us over time, if you have the stamina for one more poll, our final poll, which is a look at factors that are hindering the market and which you think is more important. Okay, so we have a very clear win, if win is the correct word, for supply chain issues. Richard, you were clearly very persuasive in your exposition of those problems. Good. Well, look, thank you all very much again. Really appreciate your contributions today. It's been a fascinating debate. And I only wish we had more time to continue it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.